Senator McCarthy.
Senator McCarthy, it was.
Yep, I just finished.
Okay. So Senator Rice.
Okay, so look, I wanted to start with the Essendon Airport crash and just in general, what's the department's response been so far following the tragedy last week?
Senator, we, like all Australians, have been terribly shocked at the tragedy of the crash last Tuesday morning. Clearly, the first priority has been the response of the emergency services agencies, and that's taken place, and the Australian Transport Safety Bureau is obviously well advanced now in its investigation. From the department's perspective, we've had a look at the development approval processes that involved in the land use planning at the airport, and we've compiled that information. We've provided advice to the Minister in relation to both the details of the accident investigation process along with the ATSB, and also in relation to the development approval process for the buildings located at the DFO site. We now stand prepared to work with the ATSB in their investigation of these matters, as well as progressing the discussion we had earlier in relation to the further work that's taking place in relation to the NASAG agenda on airport safeguarding.
Can you expand? Have you reached a position on the development approvals process?
We've simply outlined to the Minister in our advice the process that was gone through in terms of that process for the approval of that development. We await the advice from the ATSB in relation to the accident investigation.
And did you look at the issues, I mean, in that assessment or looking at it, did you look at the lack of planning, state planning controls over development on that federal site, and is that being a factor? No, we haven't. We've simply outlined to the Minister the process that was undertaken in relation to the approval of that site. The site as a Commonwealth site does not, and the legislation does not provide for state planning powers inside the airport boundary. So you haven't reached any, has it opened up the conversation about the consequences of that?
Given the nature of a number of state planning regimes, the Commonwealth operates a much more comprehensive airport planning regime that is undertaken in most state jurisdictions.
But in terms of assessing the appropriateness of that development on that federally owned site,
well, we await
is it different criteria that are used. I mean, certainly from the perspective of residents, and having spoken to them, there's very much a strong view that because it was a privatised federally owned site, that if the appropriate planning, the equivalent planning processes had been gone through under state planning laws, that those developments would not have been approved. And in fact, I know that the council, the Moonee Valley Council at the time of the DFO approval, they recommended that it not be approved, but their voice wasn't heard. So are you looking at you know, whether approval would have been, you know, appropriate if it had been considered under different planning controls?
At this stage, as I said, we've been focused on outlining the process undertaken and the approvals that were given. That may be work we undertake further. As I said, it's early days as yet. We await the advice from the ATSB into the accident causes and consequences.
Have you opened up the conversation or consideration or assessment of whether budgetary or financial pressures were driving the land use and what is now, you know, many people feel is inappropriate land use on the site? Is it something that the department's putting its mind to?
We do look quite closely at the financial viability of the leased federal airports in terms of our oversight and monitoring regime. But there's no, I don't think you can make a suggestion that the development approval process is in any way influenced by those considerations. There's quite clear planning requirements which are set out in the legislation for approving such structures. They have to be complied with. That's not influenced by the financial viability of the concern.
So in terms of how would the department, you know, respond to the community, you know, the sense in the community that it is the financial return from development on the site that has driven that development, and that if we hadn't had the airport hadn't been privatised, that development wouldn't have gone ahead. Essentially, that the underlying conditions are being driven by the financial concerns and the profits being returned to that privatised airport.
The process of non-aeronautical commercial development on airports commenced a long time before the leasing of the airports. But I think there are two separate processes. One is the oversight of the airport more generally and its viability. Secondly is the planning development process, which is set out under the legislation, and that's where our focus is at the moment, to understand precisely what considerations and providing advice to the Minister who's come into the portfolio since that development process took place, to understand what took place in the development approval process.
Can you outline for us under that planning approval process how sort of community safety is taken into account when airport land use is assessed and approved?
Certainly. I'll ask Ms Horrocks to give you an overview of our process.
Thank you, Senator. Leonie Horrocks, General Manager, Airports. So the Act prescribes a range of processes in regard to major development plans. It also sets out a range of triggers, which at what point, if that trigger is enacted, the airport is required to do a major development plan. So there's quite a few of those. So if that is triggering that, then the process is that airports can choose to provide an exposure draft major development plan to the department, and the department will provide comments to that. We refer that to a range of agencies, Commonwealth agencies, for comment, and we provide all those comments back to the airport. The airport then prepares a preliminary draft master plan, which it distributes to the community, makes public for 60 business days, and submissions are received back to the airport from interested stakeholders. The airport is required under the legislation to give due comment and due regard to all comments received, and that information is provided back when the draft MDP, Major Development Plan, is submitted to the Minister. So following that submission, the information that is provided is analysed and advice provided to the Minister, and the Minister makes the decision from there.
So can you now talk me through how and when that process applied for Essendon?
When it applied for Essendon? Yep. So in 12 December 2003, the exposure draft MDP was provided to the department. 16 January 2004, the department provided comments back to the airport on that. 28 January 2004, the airport provided an advertisement in the local paper, the Melbourne Age, to advise that the draft MDP was available for people to have a look at for public display. 28th of April 2004, in accordance with the Act, the public submissions were closed. 19th of August 2004, draft MDP was submitted to the Minister for assessment. 16th of December, the MDP was conditionally approved from there.
Will the department be looking at the submissions that were made to that NDP? Because again, as I was just saying, I mean, I know that there were many submissions that were made at the time to say that the development that was proposed in that MDP wasn't appropriate. So will the department be looking at that in terms of its assessment of the crash?
We will certainly look at the issues raised, particularly as they pertain to any findings from the ATSB in relation to it. I think it's fair to say that most of the comments were around impacts on the local community in terms of traffic and such issues.
No, there's lots of safety issues as well. Certainly there was a very active residents group that thought that the conditions as they were, because of the surrounding land use with houses being within 100 metres of a runway, were bad enough, and then adding on further development on the airport site itself were even beyond what they thought would, was sensible at all. And
Well,
I know they made those submissions at the time,
Well,
and
we'll-
they sadly feel vindicated now.
Well, we'll go back and look at some of those issues in the light of this. So obviously, officers at the table weren't involved in that process at the time. We'll look at some of those issues as the ATSB works its way through the investigation.
After the investigation, would you see that is there potential for reviewing the plan now? What would be the process, given that there's an MDP and if you've got the ATSB doing an investigation, what would be the process be if it was seen that the development plan was no longer appropriate or seen to be no longer appropriate?
Well,
How would that be reviewed or revised?
Well, essentially, we have the building is in place and is operating commercially. It is very difficult to see, subject to any findings or any safety findings in relation to the location of that building. It's very unless there were significant findings of safety risk in relation to that building, then that building is in place.
So there isn't a process of reviewing MDPs?
Well,
Once they're in place, they're in place.
Their construction has been completed
So even
and
if
is operating.
They've gone through a process, people have made submissions to say this doesn't look very good, they've been approved, we have an accident down the track, there isn't a process for reviewing them.
Well, if the advice from the investigation and subsequently from the safety regulators that there is a unacceptable risk in the location of that building and the functions it's serving, then obviously the government would have to review its position. But at this stage, that is not the case.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.